Testing. 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 Where's my pen? All right. I don't know if other people are coming tonight. I know some said they couldn't make it today. So let's go ahead and get started. I know, first off, anybody not have days? So I know last class was a bit much. A lot of names that are hard to pronounce, a lot of names that are hard to remember. Hopefully this one goes a little bit easier since there's a fair number of Western European names that might be more familiar to us. But in the context of history, I think this is kind of a pivotal moment. And we're going to get into that for a lot of reasons. In terms of the actual current conflict, we're building towards that. How do we get to the place where we're at now? I don't think the Crusades are as influential today as we might think. I think when a lot of people think about the conflict in the Middle East, they, immediately go to the Crusades as kind of, the penultimate reason as to why this kind of tension exists in this place. But I think if we've shown anything leading up to this point, there are plenty of reasons why that tension already exists. And I think the tensions of the Crusades actually belong more in history than they do in modernity. I think a lot of the things we're going to continue to talk about as we get closer and closer to modern day, I think those things will really have an impact. But there are a lot of things that happen in the Crusades. And one of the most important things for us to take note of in this time is Western European focus on what's going on in the Holy Land. All right. For the longest time, it was just the areas surrounding Israel and Jerusalem that really took notice of what was going on there. Yes, there were pilgrims from Western Europe. Yes, kings would go on pilgrimages. English kings, French kings would go. They would make that pilgrimage to Jerusalem. But in terms of interest on a political level, it had never really existed until now. So you'll remember from our last class, Islam had come sweeping in, but due to internal divisions, the emperor of the Seljuk Turks, when he died, it all begins to fragment. But the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople had lost a lot of territory. And there is this desire by Byzantium Christians to reclaim what was lost. Okay, so there is this kind of plea for assistance because what is the Eastern Roman Empire, Constantinople, the Byzantines have done nothing but shrink over the years. So their resources are limited. Their ability to mobilize forces is greatly diminished, and now they have to make a plea out west. All right. There's also something very important that we're going to talk about, and that is the theological motivations of millennialism. All right. Now, we're not talking about millennials such as myself. We're talking about the belief that with the coming year 1000 and the years following, there's this great anxiety in Christianity that the end times are near. All right. Everything's going to end. And it becomes this kind of understanding that in order for Jesus to come back, maybe the Christians need to hold dominion over the Holy Land. So this is definitely going to be something. This is definitely something that continues to exist today. But we can't start the First Crusades without talking about the man who called for it. And that is Pope Urban II. And he was, I hate to say it this way, he was trying to secure resources for the church, among other things, but he makes this plea in this kind of famous sermon in which he says, "Let those who have been accustomed to making private war for personal gain against the faithful now carry on a war against the infidels. Let those who for a long time have been robbers now become soldiers of Christ." What is Urban saying there? Let those who have been accustomed to making private war against the faithful carry on a war against the infidels. Let those who for a long time have been robbers now become soldiers of Christ.
They're going to basically flip-flop. Instead of fighting a war, as we know war today, if they're victors or whatever, then they're going to take on the beliefs and ability of Christianity.
Yeah.
For the previous soldier sins.
All right. One of the huge draws to this is that what Urban is suggesting or telling people is that if you go on this crusade, if you recapture the Holy Land, everything you've done before and everything you do during will immediately be wiped away. You know, the debt is canceled. So this is a lot of an incentive to people, you know, this is going to wash away our sins and we can even have a good time while we're doing it and have those sins washed away. But Urban has this critique, you know, you Western Europeans, we fight wars to take land. We're always concerned, you know, who's in power, whose land can we steal or grab? Now, you guys have just been robbers, stealing from each other, committing atrocities, fighting wars against other Christians. Now, we can turn our focus on someone else, these infidels, these Muslims, and we can be not sinners fighting wars, but soldiers of Christ. How do you feel about that kind of declaration by Urban? This idea that you've been fighting these petty wars before, but now you can be soldiers of Christ. Okay, how so?
To fight for Jesus and his way, his word.
Okay.
I'm just thinking, Urban's like, I got a new enemy. I let all the people under the realm of Christianity focus on this new boogeyman, using the tool to the church. That's what it is. Hey, we gotta go get rid of the bad guys.
Machiavellian prince.
If we're looking at
you're fighting anyway. You're fighting anyway, so now to get the name of the fight determination happen. Instead of focusing on this, let's focus on that. And everything you do is forgiven, so it's giving them an out for a reason. Go ahead and do what they're doing anyway.
And if we look at it from what they knew at the time, not from what we know, it was a pretty good deal if they were already to say, let's fight for a goal now. Pretty good deal.
And go ahead.
I never learned in catechism growing up as a Catholic, but the Pope has so much power to be able to use, okay, I'm the Pope, come on, not to so much the Catholic group, but total Christians from Western Europe and stuff.
So one of the interesting things about the power of the papacy is it's largely determined by who is Pope, what kind of charismatic abilities they have, and also who is a challenging authority figure around them. So what other charismatic leaders in Europe are in power? So I can't remember who the Pope was when Charlemagne became kind of king of most, what we would consider most of France. He had a disagreement with the Pope, and the Pope wouldn't consider him anointed. So he marched his army down to the Vatican and had the Pope come out and bow at his feet. But there are definitely popes, Pope Urban II being one of them, who were charismatic leaders who could kind of rally a number of people with kind of his charisma, his speaking, and this kind of call to arms. And I think, you know, I get what we're saying, and I think we can view this very cynically. I think it's very easy to. But I think on the other hand, I truly believe that a lot of the people going there believed in some way, shape, or form that the world was on the verge of ending. They had been told that. They were starting to believe it. And I think the people who thought it was and who were telling other people believed it. And there was this kind of fervor, this excitement, this idea, if we reclaim Jerusalem, if we reclaim the Holy Land, Jesus will come back. Like, this is the final roadblock. And I think we have to believe that has some part to play. It's the same thing, you know, I say it all the time, my favorite history podcast, The Rest is History. They did a podcast on the conquistadors. Yeah, sure, they're greedy. Sure, they want to grab gold and land and resources. But they are Christians who do believe in some way, shape, or form that they are there to spread the gospel. I mean, it's kind of ironic that they're going to spread the gospel while also pillaging lands and taking slaves and all of those things. But there is that genuine belief. And I think it's important for us to kind of keep this in context. I think many going on the Crusades have this genuine belief. And I think this is really summed up in Peter the Hermit. So Peter the Hermit is a very charismatic preacher, very good preacher, very well known. And when there is this kind of call to crusade, he gets really excited and he starts going around preaching, talking about what Urban had said, and he starts collecting first hundreds, then thousands of people to go on crusade. Now, the interesting thing is, most of them are not soldiers. Okay? They're people who get kind of stirred up, riled up by all this excitement, and they're like, yeah, we're gonna go. So Peter the Hermit, also not a military commander, starts marching these thousands of people out of Western Europe towards the Holy Land. We must say that on their way, they committed many atrocious acts, killing Jews in entire cities and towns, things like this. But how do you think things play out once they actually get over towards Israel? Yeah, a bunch of peasants and a charismatic preacher marching off to reclaim the Holy Land from people who are fairly competent in the ways of war, basically slaughter the entire group, and the ones who aren't killed, you know, kind of left destitute and try to return home however they can. So this is not something Urban was, you know, this was not what he was trying to do. He did not want a bunch of peasants marching out. What he wanted and what he was hoping for was Christian kings of the West or noblemen of the West to rally their forces, you know, take their men and head out. Now, what might be the problem with just assuming you're going to get all these kings and lords to just drop everything and go out east? For one, who can I trust to govern my kingdom while I'm gone for a year to 4 years? Because this isn't the age of the internet. This isn't the age of a telephone. Like, when you're gone, you might get a message like, hey, your kingdom's been wiped out and conquered by somebody else. So it is very hard to secure investment by people who are actually entrusted to rule a kingdom. So who do you think some of the people that are going to join are? There's definitely this, like, I can make a name for myself if I go do this. Because there isn't, the eldest brother who is the king or who is the lord of, this estate or this barony or whatever. You typically have the younger siblings of, lords who are like, I just have to stay here, do whatever my brother says or whatever. So I'm going to go. I'm going to take some of the forces that I can command, and I am going to go and head out. So we don't have a lot of the rulers, but what we have is some of their younger siblings. And we're going to touch, and here's the flip side. How do you get paid in war? You get what you win. It's kind of a risk, a gamble, like an all or nothing. If you win, you conquer territory, you get money, you get gold, you get silver, whatever it is. If you lose, you go home empty-handed. So there is wealth to be had. And there is some, there has been interaction between East and West. And the people in Western Europe have heard about the great riches of the East. They've heard of Byzantium. They've heard of Constantinople, Miklagard, the great city. They've heard of all these wonders of the East, the wisdom of the Arabs. So they are excited. They're having dreams about the wealth that is out East that they will be able to collect. And, during the time, who wouldn't be intrigued by big payday and the wiping away of all your sins? Like, it couldn't be a better deal. Like, this is the best of both worlds. You get to fight, we get some gold and some silver, and forgiven for everything. It's got a draw. This is a selling point. So where do I want to go next? It's interesting that a lot of things are also happening in Western Europe that kind of play in as anxiety. I believe Halley's Comet is seen streaking through the sky, and this is seen to, this is an omen of something is happening. There is also mass famines at this time, which is, kind of the book of Revelation, this idea that, the end times are near. Typically with famine, you also have pestilence, disease. So there's a lot of anxiety that is kind of playing into this. And as we continue on through our discussions, this idea of millennialism is something we're going to touch on a couple more times, because a Zionist belief kind of, in some ways, can be linked to this kind of idea of millennialism, which, like I said, is something we're going to talk about down the road. One more note, just in Peter the Hermit and the failed crusade, the People's Crusade he leaves out. That's not just men. That's women and children who are brought kind of on this crusade. Families were going. So it's pretty tragic. But they would not be the only ones. You have in your handout, let me make my notes. These major players. So we talked about Pope Urban. We talked about Peter the Hermit. Alexos I Komnenos, who is the Byzantine emperor who requested aid. He is a man who instantly regrets what he has done as soon as the Crusaders start showing up. They're talking about conquering these territories. Emperor Alexos had assumed that when these lands were recaptured, they would go to whom? Him. When these knights start showing up, they're not talking about giving this land and territory back to him. They're trying to decide who's going to rule these towns we are taking back on our way towards Jerusalem. He's also very alarmed by their hygiene, their vulgarity, the way they just generally act. He can't do anything. He is essentially let in thousands upon thousands of well-trained, heavily armed soldiers into his city. He can't do a thing. So he was the one who makes this plea. Pope Urban's the one who rallies the forces, and now they're there, and Emperor Alexos is regretting ever calling and asking for help. Now, let's get into some of the gentlemen who have made this journey, who are kind of like the head figures of the First Crusade. There's Raymond IV of Toulouse. He's a prominent noble leader, as it says, but he is also an extremely faithful person. You know, yes, he has his aims. There's wealth to be had there. But he is one of those people, I would say, is a true believer in what is being done. He is going on this trip because more than anything, he is religiously motivated. He thinks Jerusalem should belong to the Christian world, not the Islamic world. He believes that this is kind of ushering in Christ's return. So he is there as a very faithful adherent to what the belief is of the time. And next, now I am very aware of the great man theory of history, and that's that the great men of history are actually horrible human beings, but I find them immensely interesting. Bohemond of Taranto, I believe is how you say it, is one of my new favorite historical figures. And one of the reasons why is he is a Norman. Now, what do we know about the Normans? Anything? So when the Vikings are doing all of their raiding along England and northern France, they end up kind of setting up in northern France, and the emperor or the king of France cannot get rid of them. So he allots them this barony, this territory in northern France, which is called what? Normandy. And why is it called Normandy? It is the land of the Northmen. All right. So the Vikings basically set up an established village in town. And they kind of get integrated. That's one of the fascinating things I've always enjoyed about the Vikings. They kind of, in some ways, get integrated everywhere they go. They just kind of adopt the culture around them, the society around them. And that's very much what the Normans begin to do. They become Christian. They become more French. After a generation, they will pretty much only speak French. And in the early, well, mid 1000 CE, the Normans really start to come on to the world stage. So in 1066, William the Conqueror, who my will is named after, that's why I allowed his name to be William. William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, invades England and becomes the King of England. Other Norman lords had gone on these fantastic journeys into the Muslim lands, to the south, around the Mediterranean coast, and had proved themselves to be far and away the most competent military force within the Mediterranean world. And they are especially known for two things. That's building castles slash laying siege, and their cavalry. So big horses, guys in armor, picture the lances, that really medieval kind of, whenever you think of a knight, the Normans were knights before anyone else. All right. And everywhere they go, people are terrified of them. So they, more than anything, have kind of arrived onto the stage and will probably be one of the primary reasons as to why the Crusaders are so successful. Bohemond, his leadership, and his men are really a driving force for the Crusader forces as they enter into the Holy Land, or they begin in Turkey and then move their way through Syria down into Israel. Another interesting figure is Godfrey of Bouillon. And he would be elected as the defender of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre after the conquest of Jerusalem. And that's one of the interesting things about, we're not going to really get into it because it'll really sidetrack. We don't need to go in that much detail, but a lot of people were often elected to the positions. They're kind of agreed upon that, so-and-so would be Lord of this city, so-and-so, it wasn't just whoever got in there first type thing. But Bohemond and Godfrey are two very well-respected lords who have kind of made this journey. Now, I'm not going to go into all these individual battles, but the Crusaders, for the large part, are really successful. They're very successful in their conquests. This is due in large part because of the division of the Seljuk Turks. There is not some kind of singular figure who can rally the forces and kind of repel the Christian invaders. But what I do want to mention is the utter brutality with which the Crusaders operate, especially in the capturing, the taking, and the settling of cities. One of the books that I've used had a quote: "The Crusaders stormed Jerusalem and massacred its inhabitants in a bloodbath that shocked even their contemporaries." Another note, someone said walking on certain streets in Jerusalem, you would have blood up to your ankles. Even by the metrics of the day, even by the morals of the day, this was war and murder as to the likes most people hadn't seen. This was particularly brutal. Why do you think that is? Okay, there's definitely, especially when it comes to the Normans, who are notoriously brutal even in Europe, it definitely plays a part. But what do you think about on that individual basis, that individual person?
I think there's sort of the whole trip, it probably built. They
Okay.
were away from family, they were away from civilization, they were among each other, and they probably just built a hatred as they talked about what they were doing. And by the time they got there, it was probably in a fever pitch.
Okay. Long wars, long traveling, exhaustion drives people mad. What else? I think more than anything, Pope Urban II's rhetoric has given the individual crusaders what they feel is the license to kill and to act as they act. Because why? They have been promised the forgiveness of sins if they are able to recapture the Holy Land. This is pitched to them as a pilgrimage with fighting, it is a holy war. They are doing this on behalf of God. Now, I would say that this idea of a holy war did not begin with the Crusades, but bringing it to the stage in this way, mass mobilization. This isn't just two small kings fighting each other. This is people across all of Western Europe unionizing over this idea of a holy war. I would say the Crusades are kind of the pinnacle of that at this point, and probably in Western Christianity, maybe ever. But I think this will have a snowball effect. What is another word that we associate with this idea of holy war? Not a Christian English Western word. Jihad. I would say the idea of crusading and jihad are very much linked. This idea that you have been given license by God to commit atrocities will become more and more a tool as we go on. Not to say that hadn't existed up until this point, it had, but in our kind of mainstream thought, the Crusades, first, second, and third, this is where Eastern Jihad meets Western Crusades with this real clash. We typically don't like to call anything we do crusades anymore, but I would say in some ways, we have definitely continued to wage them in some shape or form, which we'll talk about kind of as this class goes on.
So I struck me that these guys. So
So the one thing that I just kind of in all my random studies throughout history, different cultures, I think it's hard to impose our modern morality on people of history. Our morals are ours, and I would say, for the most part, very influenced by Christian thought. But we didn't live in that time. We didn't live in that place. And in a lot of places in Western Europe, these are brutal places. Brutality, war, famine. Maybe what we would consider moral isn't how you lived a long life. And I would also remind you that a lot of people aren't still very literate. A lot of their understanding of God and who God is does not come from their own personal study, but is greatly influenced and guided by priests. So when Pope Urban II calls for a crusade, speaks of this holy war as a way to usher in the second coming of Jesus, why would you doubt that? I mean, these are the people you entrust your salvation to. They are the people you listen to of what it means to be a disciple of Christ. And now they're telling you, this is one of the most important things you can do as a Christian. So it does kind of why wouldn't you listen to them? And also, when these people are seen as devils and infidels and others, killing them seems like less of a moral qualm, if that makes sense. And that will become, I would say, one of the great problems of Western Christianity. They had been doing it to the Jews. They're the ones who persecuted Jesus. It's their kind, they're devils. They should be gotten rid of. but kind of broadening that out now, painting Muslims, Islam as kind of this antithesis, this force that is acting against God. I think not only the idea that your sins will be forgiven in this great crusade, but also that you're fighting someone more demon than human type thing, an adversary of God as opposed to another human being. Does that make sense? Like this is, they're less than. They're not only our personal enemies, but they are also enemies of God and thus should be exposed to the wrath of God. It cannot be overstated how much the brutality of the Christians in the First Crusade will play in to what follows. The Arabs and the Muslims who kind of witness and hear what has been done, kind of, why would it not rally them to kind of one banner? Why wouldn't it bring them together to kind of reclaim and punish those who have waged these atrocities? I'm not sure if the Christians had acted more Christian, that there wouldn't have been this, reaction when the Muslims return. But we'll never know. And I also think it's important to note that in a lot of the reconquering of some of those cities, especially those by Saladin, he does not wage the atrocities that the Christians did. He chooses the path more of mercy than of wrath and of punishment. But we're going to get to the kind of lasting impacts. Oh, man. My time just goes so fast in these classes. So we had said, I just want to make this note briefly. The emperor had assumed a lot of these lands would be returned to him. That's not the case. What they essentially become is feudal states, all right? Individual kingdoms in and surrounding the Holy Land. And what this brings in is not only more pilgrims, but also this is where we start to see knights' orders coming in. So who are some knights that you can think of, some orders?
Knights.
The Knights Templar. Who else? Yes, the Hospitallers. They kind of gain this huge presence in the Holy Land. The Teutonic Knights, the Knights of Malta. So you get these people who, it almost becomes monastic soldiers, monastic warriors. So these people kind of devoted to their faith and will take up arms to defend it. So once we had, monks and hermits, now we have monks, hermits, and militant knight orders who kind of fall under the banner of the church. It's always interesting, to hear the arguments between who leads these knight orders and the papacy about, who's in charge, who gets to control, whose orders are we following. But you get a lot of these knightly orders that begin to pop up and populate. And for the longest time, we'll be some of the only defenders. So the Knights Hospitaller, one of their main jobs was to essentially be the security convoy for large pilgrim groups. They would kind of usher them through, make sure they knew where to get water, where to get food, where to stop, and kind of offer protection from bandits and raiders. So, there's a lot of things that happen here that we're not going to talk about. All right. It's a very interesting time period, a lot of exciting, interesting things that we could dive into, but we'll get to in the weeds, and I just can't do that because I'll get lost and I'll get you lost. But this changes the Western Christian view of Jerusalem. Why do you think that is? Or how do you think it shifts? Because it was already important, right? Okay, so this idea of artifacts is kind of, they believe at this time that they find the true cross. 1,090 years later, or 1,060 years later, they have now discovered the true cross. The Holy Lance is discovered. Does anyone know what the Holy Lance is? Very good. It's supposed to be the Roman spear, the legionary spear that pierces Jesus' side. And these are seen as, relics of not only, important historical value, but also supernatural powers. It was believed, that the true cross would be carried into battle. And it was the belief, like almost like the Israelites with the ark. We can never be defeated if we carry the true cross into battle, which kind of like the ark, they'll get defeated and it will be lost. But this veneration of kind of Christian relics, it's also a huge money-making scheme. A lot of people, oh, this is a rock from, oh, this is a bone of, it'll kind of become a racket as well. A lot of holy sites will be set up. And I think, who's ever been to Israel? I know you guys have. When you go, they'll say, this is the traditional site where this is believed to have happened. Most likely at some point in this period, or, when it was under Byzantine control, they would have said, oh, pretty sure this is where this happened. And that was all the proof there was. So the traditional belief, if ever you decide to go to the Holy Land, realize that this may or may not have been where Jesus actually, had fish, sat down and shared a meal after his resurrection, or where the Last Supper took place. Because believe me, there is a church there to commemorate almost everything in the Gospels. No joke. I mean, no joke. Everywhere. Which kind of brings me back. I don't know. I'm sure I think I mentioned it, but the church that was destroyed by an Israeli bomb maybe a month ago. I'd actually been to that church. I actually have pictures in there. I think it's in Bethlehem. But I don't know, it just kind of reminded me. But yeah, there are churches everywhere dedicated to specific events. The wedding in Cana, like everything. Everything has a church to commemorate something from Jesus's life. But yes, relics will become important. The city was viewed as holy because it's the capital of Israel, but it's also, the place Jesus is crucified. In Revelation, it is, the new Jerusalem will descend. So it had this kind of important theological belief before. And you'll remember when we talked about, I think in our second class, with the Byzantines, this belief that like Christianity now superseded Judaism, like it had replaced it. So Israel in some ways was kind of like the Christian inheritance. But now possession with the First Crusade, possession of the Holy Land is seen as integral to Christianity. Like that's how important it is in this understanding. It becomes like almost a divine mandate that Christians should rule the Holy Land. And this is not something that had existed before Pope Urban II kind of proclamation that this crusade needed to take place. So now, I would say the Christian view of Jerusalem has kind of evolved and is taken something much more seriously on a faith, on a theological level, on a faith level. That new dimension and its importance has become even more rooted, which is why the Second and the Third Crusade, I would say, do happen. Once again, I kind of made the note, the brutality by the First Crusaders is something that the Muslims will talk about for generations. And what I think this kind of does is set up this kind of idea that they're now mortal enemies. Like, this isn't kings and shahs and sultans fighting. This is Christian forces and Muslim forces kind of clashing, kind of sets up this belief that we are opposed figures meant to war for our God until the end of time. And I think a lot of that is planted and watered by the brutality of the conquerors as they kind of make their way down to Jerusalem. And it is a great fear when Saladin approaches Jerusalem that everyone in the city's like, we're gonna all be killed. When they come in here, we're all dead. He's gonna pay back everything that our forefathers had done when they conquered Jerusalem. Come to find out, Saladin is not those men, which is, has anybody seen the Kingdom of Heaven movie? One of the quotes I love from that movie is Orlando Bloom's character asks him what he's going to do, if he would do what the Christians who conquered it before had done, and he says, "I am not those men." And I kind of love that quote, and that'll kind of pivot us to, I think, I'm just gonna go ahead and bring him up. Saladin. There is probably no fascinating character in history. And I cannot think of another historical figure who is the enemy of someone but is respected so highly. The Christians begrudgingly can't help but admire this man. They just can't do it. He is a brilliant tactician, a brilliant politician. And he acts, I think, the way many Christians who would critique the Crusaders' conquering of the Holy Land wished they had acted. I had said in our last class, but I'll say it again, Dante, in writing the Divine Comedy, Saladin is not in hell. He is actually considered one of the virtuous pagans. So he can't go to heaven because he's not a Christian in the Divine Comedy. But to Dante, he is too good of a person, too moral, too virtuous, too righteous to go to hell. So he's kind of stuck on that outer layer, that limbo. He can never leave, but he'll never go to hell because he was considered to be such a good person. But he is, you kind of have these reactions, this kind of great men theory. So you have Bohemond, you have Raymond, you have Godfrey, who are these great Christian leaders, crusaders, who can bring these forces together to conquer the Holy Land. Saladin is that for the Arab world. He will rally forces much larger than the Crusaders ever had to reconquer Jerusalem. So we are only in passing going to discuss Saladin's reconquering at the beginning of our next class. And then we are going to try and move through the Second and Third Crusade in our next class. And one of the reasons why I think we can do this is because though the characters change, though there are events that we should make note of, I think it's important for us to understand that the framework and the groundwork of what is coming in the future really is kind of laid here with the First Crusade. That there's true animosity and true anger, not between Eastern kings and Western kings, but Muslims and Christians. And unfortunately for the Jews, especially when the Christians have control over the Holy Land, there's still no synagogues allowed to be built. They're kept out of the city of Jerusalem. There is notoriously mass murders of Jews just on the way from Western Europe through Eastern Europe into the Holy Land. So once again, they are those who I think really suffer. It is the fall of Edessa in 1144 that will kind of rouse the Western nations of Europe to kind of start the Second Crusade. So that's kind of where we're going to pick up in our next class. So I was really hoping to have more time. I think one of the worst things to ever happen to Christianity was also one of the reasons why it was able to grow the way it did. And that was when Constantine made Christianity the official religion of Rome, of the Eastern Empire. And what that does is it introduces the church to something it had never had before. And that was an avenue towards power in this world. For the longest time, Christians were poor, they didn't have a lot, and they dang sure were not anywhere close to having the authority of emperors or governors. But when Constantine makes that declaration, the church is all of a sudden probably the most second powerful institution in the Roman Empire outside of the office of the emperor itself. And what this does, I say, is leads to mass corruption in what the church's role in the world is, and how to accomplish those goals. So evangelism by force becomes a thing. Now, I'm not saying that Christian violence didn't exist before the Crusades. But this idea that to wage war on behalf of the kingdom of God is definitely something that really takes root in Christian thought at this time. I want to hear your thoughts on that. I want to have just a brief little discussion before we head out, before we discuss. How do you feel about that? This idea of violence being ordained by the church as something God would desire, or God does desire, or God does mandate. Yeah, so I mean, for the longest, in the very early ages of the church, you know, there's stories of Roman legionnaires who were converted to Christianity who refused to fight anymore. Fight in the army, in the Roman army. And I can't remember, but there was a couple of them who were martyred, who were considered saints because they wouldn't fight and they were killed. They said they wouldn't fight because they're Christians.
Don't kill, but then who is my neighbor? That we're not supposed to discriminate in terms of who we love according to anything.
Yep.
Well, the only violent act Jesus ever committed was when they had turned the temple into a money-making machine.
Yeah.
That was so, I would think that Jesus would have been appalled at the inclusion of pagans suddenly into the priesthood, because that was part of the decree.
Okay.
And but at the same time, these things don't happen outside of God's allowable will. So there's, you know, we try to understand with God's not just
Okay.
So how is that different then? So Constantine says, all right, Christians, everybody's right? Monasteries and priests and whatever. So Luther comes along, brings the Bible, and everybody gets it in their hand. What's the, I mean, it's not a violent thing, I guess, and that's still been going on at that point, but the distribution of the gospel, I guess in both cases, is expanded, right? I'm not sure what my point is, but I'm saying.
Well, I think this.
It took, like, okay, so as violent as it was, it took root in so many more places that when it was now distributed down to the individual, maybe in the absence of having all that storytelling one-on-one relationship, you got it back to one-on-one.
One of the interesting things when we bring Luther into this is kind of his struggles with the peasants' revolt. I would say some of his more cringeworthy writing is his writing against, in favor of the German princes. You know, peasants were starving. They were being taken advantage of by the German princes. You know, the German princes were really wealthy and the peasants were really, really poor, which is why there was a revolt. And Luther very much depended on German princes' support to not be handed over to the Catholics and, you know, burned at the stake as a heretic. So he kind of stands in a tough spot, but ultimately sides with the German princes. And I think my belief is the church's call for violence is always wrong. Always wrong. The church should never advocate for war. It should never advocate for violence. It should always stand as an opposition of and critique those practices. But I very much also agree with Luther's belief that God has instituted the rulers of this age to be those who wield the sword. I mean, that's Pauline theology, that's Lutheran theology, this idea that it's the state's responsibility to stop evildoers. I also very much agree, you know, whether it's a democracy or a monarchy or whatever it is, kind of, you know, God ordains whatever leader we get stuck with in some way, shape, or form. Doesn't matter who it is, who gets elected, or who the firstborn son is that inherits a throne, whatever. You know, we kind of reap what we sow, or, you know, God has ordained those positions for better or for worse in our eyes. But I think that kind of brings up the tension that should always exist between church and state. You know, in America, we love to talk about its division. But I think if you are the church, you are never divided from this world. You are God's ambassadors in this world. You exist in those world. You exist in those world. And we should always be at tension or at odds with the rulers of the age. That's not to say we don't understand why war exists. We don't understand why violence all of a sudden appears to be necessary. But it is never something we should believe God is ordaining or that God is urging us forward to do. If anything, it should be something we grieve that needs to be done. I very much love Luther's words. This is not a place where justice resides. You know, this life is not a place where people will find true justice, true mercy, true grace. So if the church was ever meant to be in the place it found itself, and in some ways still has in the world, it should always be as an opponent or a pushback against the state, but never married to the state. And I think what we have in the Crusades is the danger when the church is not only not standing in opposition, but is actually joined in ordaining the work of. I think that's a really important distinction that is often lost, and it is no more apparent at how bad that can go than the Crusades. You know, to ordain this, to say it is a mandate of God, it is God's decree that we do this, and if you do it, you will be forgiven. That just kind of shows this is politically sanctioned, it is divinely sanctioned, and therefore, you know, we can do what we want and not feel bad about it at all. So I think, you know, you can't really divide this theocratic state existence in either Western Christianity or Islam in the East. But there are definitely priests who condemn the things that are done. This is not something that is wholeheartedly supported by all Christian nations, especially when the stories begin to come back of what has happened. But I think as we go and as we continue to build towards the modern day conflict, I think it's important for us to note that religion is always there. Sometimes it's under the surface influencing, sometimes it's ahead of anything else influencing, but it's always there. And I would say this is one of those periods of time in which it is blatantly in your face right there. And for Christianity, there might be some other periods as we go forward where it seems to be, you know, a very influential force, maybe above other things. But I think for Christianity, truly, this is kind of one of the pinnacle points in which Christianity really takes this focus on the Holy Land, and it has disastrous effects. Any other questions, comments before we?
Just on this whole subject, I was thinking, you know, this country, the original westernization of this country came from people who had been excluded from society because they disagreed with religion. So they came over here and did exactly the same thing. They excluded people who differed with them from religion. Then we had William Penn, who came and was given Pennsylvania. I'm from Pennsylvania. With the idea that he was going to create a society that did not discriminate by religion at all. All religions were welcome to come to Pennsylvania and live in peace. And it didn't happen because we had the Germans who came over, you know, the Amish who came over, and pretty soon they were separating themselves according to whether they believed in dunking for baptism or sprinkling for them and other things. So every group of Christians, and I guess, and I think this is also true of like Jews. There's all kinds of different Jewish sects, but certainly Christians tend to need, I don't know, need to separate from others according to certain beliefs and not. I don't know what I'm saying, but anyway, I think it is difficult for us to not fight over religion.
Hi. I would say one of the one of the bad fruits that comes from the Reformation is the invitation of division that will only continue to grow after Luther. I mean, Luther didn't want to leave the Catholic Church. He wanted to reform it. He wanted to change it. He was excommunicated. But what you have is this kind of continuous fracturing. Now Lutherans can't even agree on doctrine. Now we can't, we fight and we argue about different things. The Methodists right now are fighting and arguing over everything. I don't think that's religion. I think that's human nature. Yeah, this
Very much evil in your heart.
yeah, this idea of tribalism, of breaking off into your subgroups. And I think one of the ways in which you break tribalism on a kind of micro scale is to create a big tribe under a banner of Christianity. Or, in my lifetime, for me, when have I thought this country has been the most unified? 9/11. And no doubt, in my lifetime, I have never seen a country more unified than after 9/11. Because all of our individual factions, all of our tiny little tribes, all of a sudden came together as one big one, because ultimately we had another tribe to fight. And I think that's one of the things that does kind of happen in the Crusades. And that's one of the things Urban kind of leans into. It's like, you guys are just fighting other Christians, which is wrong. You shouldn't be doing it. I'm going to give you a real enemy, somebody you should actually be fighting. I was in my text study the other day, and I said, the only thing that's going to bring this country back together is another 9/11, because that's one of the ways in which you kind of set aside differences when you feel attacked. The bigger group in which you identify from what you might be in a little tribe. That's one of the things that all of a sudden brings you together, an outside threat. One of the things I just think, I think, you can be a Christian and be a soldier. Like, that's totally okay. But I don't think, seeing yourself as being ordained to go out and kill, and you have this divine mandate to do violence, is how you should view your career path, your calling to whatever it is that you've done. If anything, you should lament that you have to use your weapons. So it's not to condemn those who have to use violence. It's that we as church and we as Christians should always be that kind of pushback against that which is happening in the world. So take, for me, I'm actually going to stop this now because I don't want that going on the internet.
How many crusades were there?